The morning of May 6, 1945, crept in beneath a veil of fog that settled over the American detention camp like the breath of ghosts. Inside one of the drafty barns, Hannah Kruger lay motionless on a splintered cot, her pulse faint, her lips ashen. Around her stood a cluster of German women prisoners, silent and pale, their eyes fixed on her shallow breathing. For 3 days, the infection had consumed her. The crude bandage across her stomach was dark with fever sweat. Each breath came as a tremor, each exhale a surrender. No one dared to speak of hope anymore. They had learned that in this place mercy was uncertain, and time no longer promised rescue. Outside, U.S. soldiers paced the muddy perimeter, boots squelching against the thawing ground. They were under strict orders: the guard, record, and await transfer. No contact, no exceptions. But within that barn, the smell of sickness hung heavier than the rules of war. These weren't the fierce faces of soldiers, only young women stripped of uniforms and nations. Typists, radio operators, field nurses, remnants of a collapsing empire. Among them, Marta Vogel, barely 21, knelt beside Hannah, her trembling hands dabbed at the fevered brow with a torn strip of linen soaked in cold water. Once, she had written coded messages for officers she believed were protecting her homeland. Now, in the dim light of captivity, she wrote silent prayers against the sound of her friend's fading heartbeat. Outside, the dawn brightened to gray. Inside, despair gathered like breath in the frozen air. "She's slipping away," whispered Marta, her voice cracking. "Please, someone has to help her." Captain Daniel Reed stood in the doorway of the barn, the cold morning air thick with the scent of sickness and damp straw. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes hollow from nights without sleep. The war, though officially over, still lingered here. In the cries, the silence, the confusion that came after surrender. Inside, women huddled together on makeshift beds, shadows of what had once been soldiers of a crumbling regime. His orders were clear: process, document, and maintain distance. Yet the sound of labored breathing from the corner of the room drew him in like a whisper he could not ignore. He moved closer, boots crunching on straw and broken wood. A young German woman, Marta Vogel, was kneeling beside another whose body trembled with fever. The dying woman, Hannah Kruger, looked barely alive. Her skin was waxen, eyes sunken deep into her skull. Reed knew the signs. Infection had taken hold and time was running short. He crouched beside her, pulling back the blood-stained cloth from her abdomen. The wound was festering, its edges dark and swollen. Marta looked up, her voice trembling. "Please, she needs help." "You're a doctor, aren't you?" Reed hesitated. His breath caught somewhere between duty and conscience. "She's the enemy," said one of the guards behind him, tone flat, detached. Reed didn't answer. He looked at Hannah again, not as a soldier, not as a prisoner, but as a human being dying in front of him. War had reduced everyone to labels, but in that moment the labels didn't matter. Only the shallow rise and fall of her chest did. "She needs antibiotics," he said quietly, "and a clean bandage." The guard shifted uncomfortably. "Colonel Shaw said no treatment until they're processed." Reed stood, jaw tightening. Colonel Harlan Shaw was a man who followed orders to the letter, a career officer whose morality began and ended with regulations. Reed had served under him long enough to know there was no arguing with bureaucracy. Still, the idea of walking away gnawed at him like guilt given form. "If I don't do something," he muttered, "she won't see another sunrise." The guard said nothing. Outside, the sound of boots and distant engines carried across the camp, a reminder that the world was moving on, even as this small tragedy unfolded in silence. He found Shaw near the command tent, standing over a map scattered with red pins and smudged fingerprints. "Sir," Reed began, "one of the prisoners, a woman, she's septic. She won't last the day without care." Shaw didn't look up. "Then she won't last the day," he said coldly. "We're not running a hospital for the enemy." Reed's jaw clenched. "She's not a soldier anymore. None of them are. They're prisoners." Shaw's eyes flicked up hard as steel. "And you're a soldier, Captain. You don't decide who lives or dies, orders do." For a long moment, Reed said nothing. The weight of the war pressed on him. The years of blood, the justifications, the faces that blurred into statistics. "Orders," he whispered, the word tasting bitter. He turned sharply and walked away, his boots kicking up dust. But with each step back toward the barn, his resolve hardened. He had obeyed orders all his life. and all they had brought him was death, on both sides. Maybe defiance just once could mean something different. Back inside, Marta still knelt beside Hannah, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "Did they say they'll help?" she asked. Reed shook his head. No. Her lips quivered, but she didn't speak. The silence between them was heavy, filled with everything the war had taken and everything it had taught them to fear. Then Reed took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and knelt beside the dying woman. "Move the lamp closer," he said. Marta hesitated, then obeyed. "You'll get in trouble," she whispered. Reed didn't look up. "Maybe, but she won't die today." He worked quickly, cleaning the wound with what little disinfectant he could find, using a sterilized needle from his own kit. Each movement was deliberate, quiet, defiant. Outside, the camp buzzed with routine. Guards shouting, trucks rumbling, paperwork being stamped. Inside, time stood still. Marta watched him in awe, her trembling hands holding the lantern steady. "Why are you helping her?" she asked softly. Reed didn't answer immediately. "Because someone should," he finally said. "Even if it doesn't change anything." By the time he finished, Hannah's breathing had steadied slightly. Reed sat back exhausted, sweat trickling down his neck despite the cold. For the first time in months, he felt something that resembled purpose. He looked at Marta, a girl who had once believed in the same kind of cause that had driven men like him to war, and saw in her eyes the same question he had been asking himself for years. Where does duty end? And humanity begin? Night settled over the camp like a shroud. The fog had thickened, swallowing the fences and watchtowers until they seemed to drift in a sea of gray. Captain Daniel Reed sat outside the barn, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. The smoke curled upward, disappearing into the mist. Behind him, he could hear the faint coughing and whispered prayers of the prisoners. His pulse still raced from what he'd done. Helping an enemy prisoner might have felt righteous in another life, but here it was an act that could cost him his commission, or worse, his freedom. Yet as he listened to the weak, rhythmic breathing of Hannah Kruger, he felt no regret. Inside, Marta Vogel sat awake, her back against the cold wood. She couldn't stop staring at Hannah's face, pale but peaceful now, her fever broken by Reed's quiet defiance. The air was heavy with the smell of antiseptic and fear. Marta thought of her family back in Hamburg, or what was left of it. She had believed she was serving her country when she sent coded messages through static and wire. But the faces of the men who had shouted orders, the cities that burned because of them, they haunted her. Looking at Captain Reed, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. A man who disobeyed not out of hatred, but out of mercy. When dawn came, the camp stirred to life with the metallic clang of gates and boots. Colonel Harlan Shaw was already making his rounds, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning every face like a judge tallying sins. He stopped when he reached the barn. "Captain Reed," he barked. "Report." Reed stepped forward, expression unreadable. "All prisoners accounted for, sir." Shaw's gaze lingered on the bandages wrapped around Hannah's abdomen. "Who authorized medical treatment?" he asked sharply. The barn went silent. Marta froze. Reed didn't flinch. "She was dying," he said evenly. "I treated her." Shaw's eyes hardened. "You violated standing orders, Captain. Do you understand what that means?" Reed met his gaze without blinking. "It means she's alive." Shaw's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond right away. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then he stepped closer, his voice low and cold. "You're a doctor, Reed. You were trained to follow procedure, not to play savior. Compassion has no place in war." Reed's voice was steady but heavy with something deeper. Exhaustion, perhaps, or quiet conviction. "Maybe that's why we keep losing pieces of ourselves, sir. Because we've forgotten what compassion even looks like." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone, Captain." He turned sharply, signaling the guards to move. "From this point forward, you'll report directly to me, and you'll remember your place." As Shaw strode away, Reed felt the old anger rise in his chest, the kind that had burned through battlefields and hospitals alike. For years he'd told himself he was fighting for order, for peace, for something bigger than himself. But standing in that barn, surrounded by people stripped of everything but fear, he finally understood. He wasn't healing wounds anymore. He was preserving pain. Later that day, Reed returned quietly with supplies. A few tablets, clean cloth, a canteen of water. Marta looked up in surprise. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "If they catch you," he cut her off gently. "Then let them." She watched him work, steady hands wrapping new bandages, adjusting Hannah's position to ease her breathing. "Why risk everything for her?" she asked again. Reed sighed, his voice low. "Because someone has to remember that mercy doesn't need permission." Hours passed in near silence. Hannah stirred now and then, murmuring words too faint to understand. Marta dozed against the wall, her exhaustion finally overtaking her. Reed stayed beside the cot, listening to the faint rustle of rain on the roof. He thought of home, of a childhood in Ohio, of medical school lectures about ethics and humanity. He wondered what those professors would say now, seeing him here, risking a court-martial for an act of compassion. He knew the answer didn't matter. Some choices had to be made without justification. When morning came again, Hannah's fever had subsided. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. Reed leaned forward. "You're safe," he whispered. She stared at him for a moment, then turned her gaze toward Marta, who was just waking. "You stayed," Hannah croaked weakly. Marta nodded, tears filling her eyes. "He did too," she whispered back. Reed rose, adjusting his coat. "Rest now," he said quietly. "You'll need your strength." As he stepped outside, the camp was alive with movement. Soldiers shouting, trucks rumbling, the machinery of victory grinding forward. But Reed paused at the threshold, looking back one last time. Inside that dim barn between shadow and light, he'd found something the war had almost taken from him. Not faith, not forgiveness, but the simple, defiant act of choosing to care. By afternoon, the camp's unease had sharpened into something heavier than routine dread. Rumors traveled faster than orders. Word spread that a U.S. Army doctor had broken protocol to save a German prisoner, and every guard had their own version of the story. Some said he'd fallen for the woman. Others whispered he'd gone mad. Captain Daniel Reed walked through the compound with eyes fixed ahead, feeling the weight of those stairs pressing into his back like invisible rifles. He had seen men die for less, not from bullets but from silence, bureaucracy, and the quiet erosion of conscience. In the barracks, Hannah Kruger stirred, her mind foggy with fragments of memory. The ceiling above her seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat. She could smell the disinfectant, the damp straw beneath her cot, and something else. Smoke, perhaps, or fear. When she tried to sit up, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. Marta Vogel was at her side instantly, pressing a steadying hand against her shoulder. "Don't move," she murmured. "You're safe now." Hannah blinked, her voice a rasp. "Safe?" The word felt foreign on her tongue. Marta managed a small, hollow smile. "As safe as we can be." Outside, Colonel Harlan Shaw stood in the command tent, the canvas walls rippling under a rising wind. He stared down at the report on his desk, fingers drumming against the paper. "A captain disobeys orders, aids the enemy, and undermines command authority," he muttered. His adjutant shifted nervously. "Sir, the prisoner survived." "The men are saying—" Shaw cut him off. "The men are saying too much already." He paced the narrow space, the creak of his boots punctuating every thought. If compassion spreads through the ranks, discipline collapses. One man's mercy becomes another man's excuse. He closed the file with deliberate calm. "Bring Reed to me." The summons came at dusk. Reed entered the tent, his uniform still damp from the rain, his jaw set. Shaw didn't look up immediately. He let the silence stretch, the weight of authority filling the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, almost quiet. "Do you understand what your actions mean, Captain?" Reed met his gaze. "It means a woman didn't die on my watch." Shaw's eyes hardened. "It means you've compromised command structure. You've made yourself judge and jury in a theater where emotion has no jurisdiction." Reed took a breath. "If humanity has no place here, then what's left of what we're fighting for?" For a moment, Shaw said nothing. The lantern between them flickered, casting long shadows on the tent walls. Then he leaned forward, voice low. "You think you're saving lives, Reed. But every rule you break gives someone else permission to lose control. This is war, not a sermon." Reed didn't flinch. "War doesn't absolve us from being human, sir. It tests whether we still are." Shaw's expression didn't change, but his eyes betrayed a flash of something. Memory, perhaps, or regret. Then it was gone. "You're relieved of medical duty effective immediately," he said coldly. "You'll remain in administrative custody until further notice." Reed's pulse surged, but he stayed silent. He saluted sharply and turned to leave. Shaw's voice stopped him mid-step. "You're not a bad man, Reed, just a foolish one. Idealism doesn't survive wars. Men like us make sure of that." Reed paused, hand on the tent flap. "Maybe that's the problem, sir." Then he walked out into the storm. Rain lashed the compound that night. Inside the barn, Marta listened to the distant thunder and wondered what would happen to the doctor who had risked everything for them. Hannah was sleeping again, her breathing shallow but steady. Marta pulled the blanket higher, whispering a prayer she hadn't said since childhood. The camp, once just a cage of wire and mud, now felt like a living thing, breathing, watching, waiting. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air cold and sharp. Reed stood by the fence, watching the mist rise off the wet earth. He could see the women lined up for roll call, the guards barking orders, the machinery of post-war order grinding on. Shaw's reprimand echoed in his mind, but beneath the anger was a strange calm. He had done what he believed was right, and no tribunal could take that away. As he turned to leave, he saw Marta watching him from across the yard. Their eyes met, not in defiance or fear, but in quiet recognition. That fleeting connection, the unspoken understanding between the condemned and the guilty, between healer and survivor, lingered long after they parted ways. In that moment, Reed realized that mercy, even in chains, was its own kind of rebellion. The days that followed blurred into gray sameness. For Captain Daniel Reed, time lost its rhythm, marked only by the scrape of boots in corridors and the dull clang of metal doors. His uniform was gone, replaced by an anonymous jacket, the symbol of his suspension. He spent hours in silence, replaying every choice that led him here, every bandage tied, every breath saved. Outside, the war was officially over, but inside this camp it lingered like a ghost that refused to leave. Rules were being rewritten, justice redefined, yet mercy still felt like mutiny. Colonel Harlan Shaw watched the reports pile up on his desk, each one demanding closure. Orders from headquarters insisted on efficiency. Process the remaining prisoners, dismantle the camp, move forward. But Reed's defiance gnawed at him. In another time, another place, he might have admired it. But admiration was a luxury officers couldn't afford. He poured himself coffee gone cold and stared out the window at the yard below. He saw Marta Vogel guiding Hannah Kruger, who now could walk short distances, her frame fragile but determined. Something in that sight unsettled him. In the barn, Hannah's steps were uncertain but deliberate. The other women watched her with quiet awe, not because she had survived, but because she had been saved. In a world that had stopped believing in grace, her recovery felt like rebellion. Marta supported her carefully, whispering encouragement. "Slowly," she said. "You'll regain your strength." Hannah smiled faintly. "Strength is not the same as freedom," she murmured. Marta paused. "No," she agreed softly, "but it's a beginning." Around them whispers grew, of the doctor who risked his rank, of the colonel who couldn't crush compassion entirely. That afternoon, Reed was called to the interrogation tent. The room was bare, a table, 2 chairs, a single folder. Shaw sat opposite him, posture immaculate. "This is your formal inquiry," he said, voice clipped. "Do you wish to make a statement?" Reed folded his hands. "Only that I did what my oath required." Shaw's brow tightened. "Your oath was to your command, not to sentiment." Reed met his eyes steadily. "My oath was to preserve life." The colonel leaned back, studying him like a puzzle he couldn't solve. "You're a good man, Captain, but good men don't survive long in uniform." Reed's answer came quietly. "Then maybe the uniform needs to change." Shaw's expression hardened. "You think you've made a point, but all you've done is complicate the end of a war that cost millions. Mercy can be dangerous when people mistake it for weakness." Reed tilted his head. "Or maybe it's dangerous because it reminds us we're still human." Shaw looked away, his jaw working, a flicker of doubt crossing his features before the mask returned. "You'll remain under observation until further notice," he said finally. "The tribunal will decide your fate." When Reed was escorted back to his quarters, the camp felt different, quieter, almost reverent. A few guards nodded faintly as he passed. a silent acknowledgement of something they couldn't say aloud. Word had spread beyond rumor now. It had become a story, one whispered from tent to tent, that Mercy had returned if only for a night. He didn't know whether to feel pride or dread, perhaps both. That evening, as rain began again, Marta slipped out of the barracks and approached the fence separating prisoners from officers. She carried a small scrap of paper torn from a ration label. When she reached the shadowed corner where Reed often stood, she whispered, "Captain." He turned, startled. She pressed the note through the wire. "It's from her," she said. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. "Thank you for remembering I was still a person." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he whispered, "Tell her she doesn't owe me thanks. Just live." Marta's eyes glistened. "You've done more than save her," she said. "You've reminded us we still matter." Reed looked past her at the gray horizon. "Then make it count," he replied. "Because people like Shaw will erase us the moment the war becomes history." She nodded, understanding. Then she vanished back into the darkness. As the night deepened, Reed stood alone by the fence, the paper trembling in his hand. Around him, the camp creaked and settled, the sounds of weary souls clinging to a fragile dawn. He realized then that Mercy didn't need to win to matter. It only needed to exist. And sometimes that was victory enough. By early June, the camp was changing. Fewer guards walked the perimeter, and the trucks came more often, carrying prisoners away in silence. Each departure was both relief and loss, a reminder that the world outside still existed, though no one knew what waited beyond the wire. Captain Daniel Reed remained confined to quarters, his future uncertain. The tribunal had not yet convened, and that delay gave him time, too much time, to think. He wondered whether Mercy could survive in reports and testimonies, or if it would die quietly between the lines, unrecorded, like so many other small rebellions. Colonel Harlan Shaw sat in his office reading a telegram from headquarters. It was short and unsympathetic. Begin full closure of facility within 3 weeks. Expedite all remaining cases. He folded it neatly, though his jaw tightened as he did. The bureaucracy had spoken, reducing lives to inventory. Shaw was a man who followed orders, but lately, those orders had begun to feel like a hollow echo. The memory of Reed's defiance haunted him, not as a challenge to authority, but as a mirror reflecting everything he had once believed in and then buried beneath duty. Meanwhile, in the women's barracks, Hannah Kruger could finally stand without support. The scar on her abdomen still ached, but the pain grounded her, proof she had survived. Around her, the women moved with a quiet rhythm, washing, folding, sharing stories in whispers. Their laughter, faint but real, returned like spring after a brutal winter. Marta Vogel noticed it first, how Hannah's survival changed the air, how even the guards seemed to hesitate before barking orders. Hope was a dangerous thing here, but it had crept in anyway, disguised as routine. That night, Marta and Hannah sat near the dim lantern, mending a torn blanket. "Do you ever think about after?" Hannah asked softly. Marta smiled faintly. "After what?" Hannah shrugged. "After this. After the fences." Marta's hands paused. "I used to," she said. "Then I stopped because it hurt too much." Hannah nodded. "Maybe that's why we have to start again." The simplicity of the words struck Marta like a confession. They didn't know where they would go or if they'd be welcome anywhere. But for the first time, after sounded possible. A few days later, Shaw visited Reed's quarters. He entered without preamble, closing the door behind him. "Headquarters wants the tribunal done before the camp closes," he said. Reed didn't stand. He only looked up. "And you?" Shaw hesitated. "I think they want to make an example." Reed gave a small, bitter smile. "Mercy as misconduct." Shaw ignored the remark, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. "You made a choice that challenged my authority, Captain. But maybe it was I who lost sight of what authority was for." Reed studied him. "Orders end, Colonel. Consequences don't." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Shaw finally said, "There's a convoy leaving for Munich tomorrow. I'll see to it that Kruger and Vogel are on it." Reed frowned. "Why?" Shaw looked toward the window. "Because this place doesn't deserve people who still believe in decency." Reed stood. "And me?" Shaw met his gaze. "You'll stay until they decide what to do with you." He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, you reminded me that sometimes rules need men brave enough to break them." Then he was gone. The next morning, word spread quickly. The prisoners were to be transferred. Marta packed what little she owned: a comb, a folded scrap of paper, a tin cup. Hannah moved slowly, still weak but determined. When the guards came, she glanced toward the administration hut, hoping for one last glimpse of the man who had saved her life. Through the fog, she saw Reed standing by the gate, flanked by 2 MPs. Their eyes met across the distance, a silent farewell between a woman who had survived and a man who had paid the price for believing she should. As the trucks rumbled to life, Marta squeezed Hannah's hand. "We'll tell your story," she whispered. Hannah nodded, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Tell his too." The gates creaked open and the convoy moved forward, carrying them into an uncertain dawn. Behind them, the camp shrank into the mist, its barbed wire glistening with dew like threads of memory. And somewhere inside, Captain Daniel Reed stood watching until the last engine faded, knowing that history would forget their names, but not what they had meant to each other in that brief, fragile act of mercy. The convoy moved through the ruins of Bavaria, past villages half buried in ash and silence. Hannah Kruger watched from the truck bed, her breath fogging against the cold metal. Each passing mile felt like crossing from one kind of captivity into another. Around her, the women were quiet, not because they were afraid, but because there were no words left for what they'd endured. Beside her, Marta Vogel clutched the folded note Hannah had once written for the doctor. She held it like a relic, the last fragment of proof that mercy had existed in a place built to erase it. When they reached the relocation station, the guards unloaded them methodically. There were tents, paperwork, and faces that looked at them without judgment but without warmth. The Allied officers spoke of repatriation and civilian reintegration, words that sounded clean but felt hollow. Marta signed the forms without reading. She kept her eyes on the horizon where the mountains cut the sky, sharp, distant, unreachable. Hannah stood beside her, hand trembling slightly as she accepted a ration card. "Do you think they'll remember us?" she asked. Marta shook her head softly. "Maybe not us, but maybe what he did." Miles away, Captain Daniel Reed sat before the tribunal board, 3 officers seated like marble statues behind a wooden desk. Colonel Harlan Shaw stood to the side, serving as both witness and reluctant judge. The room was airless, the kind of space where justice was stripped down to procedure. "Captain Reed," the senior officer began, "you're charged with direct violation of military protocol and insubordination under Article 27. How do you plead?" Reed looked straight ahead. "Guilty," he said quietly. Shaw's gaze flickered, but he said nothing. "Do you wish to make a statement?" the officer asked. Reed nodded. "Only this. Compassion should never be treated as a crime." There was no applause, no acknowledgement. Just the scratching of pens and the shuffle of papers. The board deliberated for less than an hour before delivering its verdict. Suspension without reinstatement. Dishonorable discharge pending review. Shaw dismissed the court with a curt nod, though his expression betrayed unease. As Reed stood, one of the junior officers whispered, "You did the right thing, sir." Reed didn't respond. He simply adjusted his coat and walked into the rain, the echo of boots behind him fading like the remnants of an old war song. In the refugee station, Hannah and Marta shared a cot under a leaking canvas roof. The world outside buzzed with rebuilding. New governments, new alliances, new promises. But here, everything still felt temporary. Marta traced the scar along Hannah's wrist, a reminder of the infection that had nearly killed her. "He saved you," she whispered. Hannah looked toward the tent flap, where a thin line of moonlight cut through the dark. "No," she said softly. "He reminded me I was worth saving." They fell silent, each clinging to that fragile truth as though it might hold back the weight of the past. Weeks passed. The women were moved again, to a small camp near Augsburg this time. Work was hard, but it was life. They washed uniforms for soldiers, mended torn flags, planted gardens, and cracked soil. Marta began keeping a notebook, recording the names of every woman who'd passed through their barracks, afraid history would forget them. Hannah drew small sketches in the margins, faces, hands, a single pair of eyes that always looked like Reed's. When Marta asked why, Hannah only said because memory fades slower when you give it shape. In late summer, A letter arrived. It came through the Red Cross, folded and water-stained. Marta opened it carefully, her heart pounding. The handwriting was unmistakable. "I don't know where this will find you. They say my service is over, but I think I've only now begun to understand what service means. You reminded me that healing isn't a duty, it's a choice. If you find peace, keep it. If you find anger, forgive it. And if you remember me, let it be for what we tried to be human in a time that wasn't." It was unsigned, but they both knew. That night, Marta read the letter aloud to the others. The women listened in silence, tears glistening in the lantern's glow. When she finished, Hannah whispered, "He's free." Marta folded the letter gently. "Maybe not," she said. "But so are we." The wind rustled the tent, carrying the faint scent of rain and wood smoke. Outside, the world was slowly stitching itself back together, though the seams still showed. Inside, among the forgotten, mercy had left its mark, not as a grand gesture, but as the quiet persistence of memory. 10 years later, Germany was unrecognizable. Cities once buried in rubble now glittered with new steel and glass. Markets buzzed, trains ran, and laughter, cautious, unfamiliar laughter, returned to the streets. But beneath that thin layer of progress lay unhealed scars. Hannah Kruger stood at the edge of a rebuilt Munich square, watching children chase pigeons across the cobblestones. She was 33 now, her limp barely visible beneath her long coat. In her hands she held a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile. The letter that had arrived years ago from a man she had never seen again. She had built a small life, quiet but steady. A job as a nurse's aide at a local clinic, a rented room above a bakery. Mornings spent tending to patients who rarely asked about her past. Marta Vogel lived nearby, working as a teacher for displaced children. The two women rarely spoke about the camp anymore, but sometimes in the hush before dawn, one of them would mention the doctor. They didn't say his name, not out of secrecy but reverence. He had become something larger than a man. He was a memory that refused to fade. Across the ocean, Captain Daniel Reed, now simply Daniel, walked the quiet halls of a hospital in Boston. His discharge had ended his military career, but not his purpose. He treated veterans now, men haunted by battles long over. Some came with missing limbs, others with wounds no scalpel could touch. Every time he wrapped a bandage or steadied trembling hands, he thought of the barn in Bavaria, the smell of rain and antiseptic, the sound of Hannah's rasping breath. It was there, not on any battlefield, that he had finally learned what healing truly meant. One winter afternoon, Marta received a letter forwarded through the International Red Cross. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the seal was American. She opened it slowly, heart racing. Inside was a short note from a hospital administrator in Boston. Captain Daniel Reed passed away in November. Among his effects was a list of names, German civilians treated at Camp 46, Bavaria, 1945. Yours and Ms. Kruger's were among them. He often spoke of the women who reminded him of his duty to remain human. Please accept his condolences posthumously with gratitude. Marta read it twice before passing it to Hannah. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, though she smiled through them. "He remembered," she whispered. Marta nodded. "He always would." They sat in silence for a long while, the snow falling softly outside. Then Hannah rose and went to the small shelf by her window. From it she took a candle, plain white, unremarkable. She lit it carefully, setting it beside the letter. "For him," she said. The flame flickered once, then steadied, its light catching the edges of the paper like gold. Marta placed a hand on her shoulder. "For Mercy," she added quietly. Years continued to pass. The world moved forward, faster and louder, until stories like theirs seemed too small for history books. But in a quiet clinic in Munich, patients often spoke of a kind nurse with gray eyes who listened more than she spoke, who treated even the poorest with the same care she once received. When asked why she never married, she only smiled. "Because some promises," she said, "are made without words." And every year on the 6th of May, she lit a candle at her window, not for loss but for remembrance. In Boston, a plaque hung in a hospital corridor, in memory of Captain Daniel Reed, who believed compassion was not weakness, but courage. Few knew his story, fewer still the lives he had touched. But somewhere across the Atlantic a single flame would flicker each spring night, echoing that belief, that even in war, The smallest act of mercy could outlast empires. And in that soft light, their stories remained bound together, not by tragedy, but by the defiant grace of having chosen to care when the world had forgotten how. The war had ended long ago, but its ghosts remained, not in the ruins of cities nor in the medals and monuments, but in the quiet choices of ordinary people who refused to let hatred define them. Captain Daniel Reed, Hannah Kruger, and Marta Vogel were never written into textbooks. Their names didn't appear in military archives or political speeches. Yet their story endured in whispers, passed down through families who had once been strangers, united by a moment of mercy in a world collapsing around them. It is easy to remember the victors, their flags, their triumphs, their speeches carved into stone. But history is built on smaller acts, on the seconds between cruelty and compassion, when a person decides who they truly are. Daniel Reed's choice in that Bavarian barn was not recorded in any report, yet it carried further than any bullet fired in that war. His defiance wasn't loud. It was the quiet courage of a man who chose to save rather than destroy. And Hannah, the woman the world would have forgotten, became a symbol of the human spirit's refusal to surrender. Her survival was not just a victory over death, but over the very idea that enemies must remain enemies. She had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in its redemption. In her later years, when asked why she continued to light that candle every May, she would smile and say, "Because someone once saw the human in me when I could not." Marta, too, carried the memory like a fragile relic. She never spoke publicly of what happened, but her students would later recall how she taught history differently, not as a list of dates and wars, but as a question. When your moment comes, will you be kind? That was the lesson the world had forgotten amid the ashes of 1945. That kindness is not weakness but resistance, not sentiment but strength. In the end, their lives intersected for only